Cool. We're almost at the end of the evening. Yeah, I'm James, and I'm going to talk about something that I call design token interfaces. Let me introduce myself first. So, hi, I'm James. I currently work at Investec. Our logo is a zebra, so hence the crappy doodle, where I co-lead our design system, the imaginatively titled Investec Design System, or IDS. In my spare time, I have also been involved in the Design Tokens community group. I'm one of the authors for the Design Token format spec. So if you're really into your design token nerdery, then you might have heard of that. And if you want to see me shouting into the void online, you can find my website there or scan the code. And that's got links to my Blue Sky and Mastodon and stuff where I occasionally shitpost. Design tokens. They're in their most basic form, they're just named design values, right? As sizes, fonts, etc. And a lot of the time, people have what a lot of us call primitive tokens or foundational tokens, where we're really just describing the value, right? These are things like your color ramps, your red 100, 200, 300, size ramps, etc. And then there are tokens that have references rather than actual values. So they point to another token. Some people call this aliases. And if the thing being pointed to changes its value, that gets reflected by the thing that's pointing to it. And we often use these to build more semantic tokens. So these are ones that have names that describe their design intent, like their purpose in the UI. For example, an interactive background color or a link color or something like that. And I'm using colors here as an example, but this could just as well be sizes, fonts, you name it. And then, of course, downstream from that, in our components or our UI more generally, we reference those things to style up our UI. Now, some design systems then have this third component here. So I think Matt was showing that screenshot from Spectrum earlier with the big graph with like thousands of tokens. So some people do that. Not everyone does. We don't at Investec. We just kind of reference the semantic ones directly. But for completeness, that does exist. And this kind of tiered approach with this 3-tier architecture, so if I just flesh that out a little bit more to make it more realistic, has emerged as a sort of a common architecture, as a useful pattern that a lot of design systems have. And I think part of the reason it's popular is because it makes things like theming or modes like light and dark color schemes or different spacing densities relatively easy, because you can achieve them by just changing what your semantic tokens are pointing to, right? Because the design intent is the same. It's still a background or a text color or a font size or something. And you'll notice, as I sort of flip between these, the references from components to the semantic don't change. So we can sort of shift that responsibility of how the values get assigned based on the user preferences or the context or whatever, sort of further upstream. And a lot of, like I say, a lot of design systems are kind of organized this way, but this, I think, if you look at it this way, there's a sort of, that semantic tier creates like a dividing line. And if you imagine sort of cutting along that line and splitting those things apart, I'd argue you end up with sort of two parts of the system. You've got what I tend to call the theme on the left. That's the thing that provides values to those semantic tokens. And then on the right, you've got your UI, your components, or just your, the UI between your components that is referencing those things to style itself up. And this kind of relationship is sort of implicit in a lot of design systems. But I started to wonder, what if we made it explicit? What if we called out that dividing line as an entity in its own right? And this is what I mean by a design token interface. So what does it consist of? Well, it's a description of what the tokens are, so their names, got their types, are they colors, are they font sizes, are they dimension values? They might have other metadata, they might have descriptions for documentation or information about the status, are they deprecated and things like that. The only thing they don't have that a token normally has is a value. So they're kind of these valueless tokens. And to the handful of developers who put their hands up earlier, this might look familiar because this is very similar to APIs in programming, right? Application programming interfaces, which are sort of dividing line between something that provides some kind of functionality and other things, other bits of software that consume that functionality and use it. And the API is often described as a kind of contract. It defines what is what are the functions, what are the data types that the thing needs to provide. And then things that use the API don't know or care what sits on the other side that's providing that. And likewise, the thing that provides it doesn't necessarily have any awareness of the things that are using it. So just as in programming, I think if we apply that thinking to design tokens, that might have some useful applications. So the first is we can divide and conquer. We can kind of create a nice division of responsibilities, right? So from the perspective of our UI code, it doesn't really matter what's going on in the theme, right? Whether that's got no modes or 100 modes, or whether it's an entirely different theme altogether, as long as it's filling in the same blanks with the same types, you're still getting colors, you're still getting font sizes or whatever you need. So other than your appearance changing, you don't have to touch anything in your designs or your component code. And so, whether we have light or dark modes or just an entirely different theme that's applying a complete, visual revamp, nothing changes on the right-hand side. Likewise, if we're busy building or maintaining our themes, we don't know or care what UI is using those themes. So maybe, we're doing what I showed earlier. We've just kind of got some sort of notion of tiers and we're changing the references based on modes or something like that. Or maybe we've got a totally different architecture. We've got something more complex going on behind the scenes. Like if you think of Figma, you might have multiple collections that are referencing each other and it becomes this kind of rat's nest of relationships. Or it might be something really simple, right? Why not just, if you don't need all that complexity, literally just fill in values for those semantic tokens. It doesn't matter as far as the components are concerned. Or you could go nuts and you could have, I don't know, some runtime thing that is taking, like Material UI, looking at the dominant color of your wallpaper photo and, I don't know, the position of Venus and the time of day and auto-generating color palettes and sizes and whatever else. And I think the beauty of this division is these things can evolve independently, right? So you could be taking a simple theme and making it more complex or adding fancy stuff like this, all the while not having to touch your components. Or you could be working on components, adding more components, or as consumers, you could be directly using the design tokens to build designs and screens, and they're independent of changes or updates to the theme. And it could be even different teams or different people working on these things, right? You can imagine in big organizations with multiple brands or whatever, different teams might own and maintain their own individual themes. As long as they all fulfill that same interface, it works. I think it opens the door to doing things like testing the themes themselves. So we probably are familiar with testing UI components, right? We might test accessibility, performance, or this and that. But how many of us actually test the themes themselves? So in our Investec design system, we've kind of started doing this. So we've applied this concept of a design token interface. We call it our theme interface. And we built a tool. So in our setup, we've got a Figma library with variables and different collections as our kind of starting point. We export that as a design token file. And then from there, we translate it into code. And in Figma, it's really easy to rename a variable or delete one or add one, but that can have disastrous consequences in the code. So we wrote this little tool which knows our interface. Whenever we do a new export from Figma, it compares against that interface, and it will tell us if something's been renamed or something's gone missing or a new thing is snuck in that shouldn't be there. So we catch those problems early and we can deal with them before they cause too much damage. Another thing we've started exploring but haven't fully fleshed out yet is doing color contrast checking at that level. So we've got, like I'm sure a lot of you do, design tokens that are intended for background colors and other ones that are intended for foreground and like text or borders or whatever. And we can define rules, right? You can say, well, any one of these must be pairable with any one of those, and it must have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 or 3 to 1, or whatever you need. And we can test that, right? We can write a tool which can work out all the possible permutations of combinations of one and the other, iterate over every theme or mode in the theme or combination of modes, and just work out those ratios and then tell us if something is not hitting or not meeting that criteria. And because you're just operating on the data, those tests run really, really fast. So you can check that stuff a lot quicker than you can when you're sort of doing it downstream in the UI, right? Like, yeah, you can run Axe or something on your UI, but it's got to do a lot more work to test the same stuff. Obviously, it assumes that your tokens are being used appropriately in the components, but as long as you're doing that, we can potentially save ourselves some grief by doing this kind of testing. So I sometimes call this design it like you mean it. If you've got that kind of tiered approach and you've got your semantic tokens, especially if you're kind of calling it out as a distinct interface, I would argue those are the only tokens you should be using in your UI, right? The minute someone is kind of reaching behind the curtain and directly wiring up a red 500 somewhere in the UI, they break things, right? That's no longer going to change when you go from light mode to dark mode or high to low contrast or a different brand or whatever it is. So whereas if you limit yourself to just the semantic tokens, then, as with that division of responsibilities, anything the theme can provide or future iterations of the theme will continue to work seamlessly. So ideally, I think, this is my spicy hot take. Oh, yeah, I should have mentioned at the start. I'm here as myself, right, as a fellow design token owner. I'm not representing Investec or the design tokens community group. So any spicy hot takes are entirely my own, not theirs. Right, but that out of the way. I think you should do that, right? I think you should take those primitives and things off the table, like take away the temptation from the designers and the developers. And that's kind of what I mean by designing it like you mean it, because you're choosing things based on those semantic intents, not how they look. So instead of thinking, oh, that spacing is a bit tight, I want to go from, 32 pixels to 64. It's like, no, you find another token that is descriptive of that purpose of what you're trying to achieve and trust the system to provide an appropriate value. It's not your job to pick colors anymore. The system does that. So essentially, if you imagine some setup, you've got some theme doing whatever it's doing, that stuff is off limits. Do not touch. And again, so in IDS and our design system, we do exactly that. In Figma, we can hide the variables from publishing. It's a bit tedious having to go through and right-click and but you can do it. That way, for the designers, those things are taken off the table. But how do we do that for developers? So again, we made a little tool. So as I mentioned, we export from Figma to design tokens, obviously the DTCG format, because it's close to my heart. And then we've got a tool that goes through our interface, so it knows which tokens are supposed to be there, resolves the values for all of those. So it'll follow all of those references and work out, what's at the end of that chain, and produce a new DTCG file, which has just got that. So we're going from something like this to that. And that's the one we then feed into the tools that generate code, so things like Style Dictionary or Terrazzo. And that way, the output is guaranteed to not leak any of your private tokens out into the wild. So here is kind of a little screenshot. So this is before, this is what comes out of Figma. It's got references. As you can see, we've got different modes there. And then the output on the right is after that transformation's taken place and it's figured out the values. It's also figured out that in this instance, there's more than one mode that influences this thing, which is why it's ended up with 4 values. What you can't see is then that all the things that would have been referenced have been stripped out, so they've gone. And I think that also has implications for how you document your tokens, right? If you take that approach. So, you know, I'm sure we've all seen style guides and documentation sites that document the primitive ramps, right? Here is the hex code for our blue 500. Here is the pixel value for space XXL or whatever. I'm saying, don't do that. Take it away. Like, why does anyone even need to know that stuff? As an alternative, I really love what Atlassian have done in their design system. So they've got this wizard where it prompts you with a few questions and you kind of answer them. And after a few steps, basically you end up with like, here are some tokens that you should be using for your situation. So we haven't done that yet in our documentation, but I totally want to rip off that idea. Thanks, Atlassian. Then there's something I call infiltration because I wanted to give it a catchy name. So if our design systems had these interfaces and we made them explicit, what if we mapped one to another? So let's say that one in the middle there is, or the one on the right, I should say, is our design system's design token interface. And then the one on the left is that of another one. So that I've kind of loosely based this on Bootstrap. We could create a mapping from one to the other. We could say, well, our background one, you know, in terms of its purpose is equivalent to body background or whatever on the other one. Once you've got that mapping, any of the other design systems theme will plug into your system. So you could, in this hypothetical example, map it to, say, Bootstrap, and then find any old Bootstrap theme online and plug it into your system, and it would color up and style up your UI. Now, that, of course, is a bit of a niche use case. Like, why would you do that? But I think there is a real-world application which is transitioning from one design system to another, or one substantial generation to another, which is something that we're kind of doing and Investec. In my previous job, we had a similar story where we had an old design system that we were trying to retire and move to a new one. Yeah, I'm seeing some nodding heads there. And it's hard to do big bang, right? Like that's a substantial amount of work for product teams to completely redo their UIs. So they're probably not going to want to do it. So you can make it easier for them by allowing incremental adoption. So they can sort of gradually swap out components from old to new. And so they can go from something that's entirely old, which is blue here, drop in some new stuff, which is the red, and then eventually end up where it's all, all new stuff. But in that in-between state, you don't want the UI you actually ship to your users to look like a mess, right? You don't want to have different design languages kind of sitting side by side on the same screen. So you can smooth the differences potentially by, for that intermediate state, providing a mapping of your new design system interface to the old one. So then your new components kind of look a bit like the old ones and they don't stand out. So they can sneak in, camouflage, hence, infiltrate, right? So I think for that kind of thing, that could be useful. And then there's sort of the, if you will, the inverse of that, we call infusion. So I'm guessing some of you will have that scenario where someone wants to use some third-party widget or some specialist component with your design system. It might be something like charting, right? Like how many of us want to build our own version of high charts? We're just going to use high charts, right? Or if you've done data tables like AG Grid and things like that, that's where you're probably going to just lean on a third party, or maybe social media widgets could be another. Now, they'll typically have some customization options, and you could think of those as another type of design token interface, right? So then your job is to map your thing to their thing, and then those components will blend in with your design system because you've infused them with your design tokens, and you look, right? And then obviously, again, you can be evolving your theme or swapping your theme, and all that stuff is just going to work. So they're sort of kind of the same but different, if you see what I mean. So hopefully I've sort of made the case and maybe whetted your appetite for like why there's value in taking this sort of implied interface and relationship that I think exists already in a lot of design systems, but actually drawing out as an explicit thing, and that's the thing you should document and sort of, you know, opens the door to doing interesting stuff like this. So, having been involved in the design token standard formats, my head obviously goes to like, well, should we have a standard for this as well? And this is kind of my ulterior motive for giving this talk tonight. Like, I'd love to hear from all of you your views. Like, am I mad here, or am I onto something? Like, does this feel kind of useful? And if it does, you know, is that something we should sort of try and make easier for all of us to use? So I can share how we do it at Investec, and I think this isn't a complete solution, but I think this might be a starting point. So we basically just took the DTCG format, but we said, we bent the rules a little bit, and we kind of said, you know, we have our tokens, they have types, it's not shown here, they may have some of the other properties that we support, like descriptions or deprecated status, but what they don't have is values. So we just use null, which works in JSON, as a kind of a way of denoting that this is a placeholder token, effectively. It works for us. The tools I showed earlier have been built around this. I don't think this is yet a universal solution. That's like, I don't know how this would work with things like the resolver spec, or whether or not they should be a separate thing that, or can be mixed with the standard format. So that's where, you know, we as a community maybe need to work on this. But I do want to turn this into some sort of proposal on GitHub and then kind of see where it goes. And I think if something like this did emerge, that would mean, you know, the tools become interoperable, right? Then like we wouldn't have to just build and maintain our own little scripts. We could just use some off-the-shelf tool to do the thing. Or maybe we could open source the things we've already made and all of you could use them, right? That'd be cool. I think a worthwhile mention here is, so hopefully I'm going to get his name right, Steve Dodier-Larazo, who I think may have spoken at a previous event, right? Yeah. He proposed a few months ago this thing called the token listing format, which I think there's a potentially a lot of overlap between what I'm talking about and what he's proposed there. It's focused more on the documentation of the tokens, but in effect, it's describing tokens, but not assigning values to them. So in that sense, it's very similar. So I'll also be reaching out to him, but I think I haven't quite figured out in my own head whether these are separate things or related things or what. But again, that's where I would love to hear from all of you what you think and whether that's something you'd like to help out with. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble here. And there's a link again in case you missed it. Cheers.